When we think of the Middle Ages, we usually picture kings, knights, and peasants. We imagine serfs toiling away in the fields, tied to the land, but generally left to their own devices in their small, thatched-roof villages. But there is a much darker, much more profitable foundation that built the medieval world.
One that history classes often gloss over. I'm not talking about serfdom. I'm talking about the booming, global, and utterly ruthless medieval slave trade. From the Viking strongholds of the frozen north to the opulent palaces of the Islamic caliphates and the bustling merchant docks of Venice, human beings were the ultimate luxury commodity. Today, we're going to uncover how millions of people were captured, traded, and used by the ultra-rich of the medieval era. To understand how slaves lived, we first have to look at how they were acquired. And in the early Middle Ages, nobody dominated this business quite like the Vikings. The Norsemen weren't just raiders looking for gold and silver. Their primary, most lucrative cargo was human. When Vikings raided the coastlines of Britain, Ireland, and Francia, they captured thousands of men, women, and children. They called these captives thralls. Dublin, Ireland actually grew into a massive Viking settlement, largely because it functioned as one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe. But the Vikings didn't just sell locally. They navigated down the rivers of Eastern Europe, dragging captives from Slavic tribes to trade with the wealthy Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates.
By the High Middle Ages, Christian Europe officially frowned upon enslaving fellow Christians. But there was a massive loophole. Pagans, and those considered heretics, were fair game. The wealthy maritime republics of Italy, like Venice and Genoa, built colossal trading empires off the backs of human trafficking. They set up trading posts around the Black Sea, buying captives from the Mongol Golden Horde or local warlords. In fact, so many people from the Slavic regions of Eastern Europe were captured and sold during this period that the word Slav became the root for the word slave in many European languages.
So, who was buying? The short answer? The medieval 1%. Owning slaves was the ultimate status symbol for wealthy nobles, affluent merchants, high-ranking church officials, and royalty. A wealthy medieval household in cities like Genoa, Venice, Constantinople, or Cairo was practically expected to run on slave labor.
When a fresh shipment of captives arrived at a Mediterranean port, they were marched to the auction block. They were inspected like livestock. Buyers would check their teeth, their muscles, and their eyes. Prices varied wildly based on age, gender, and skills. A strong man was prized for heavy labor or military service. Young, beautiful women were highly sought after by the wealthy elite to serve as domestic servants or concubines. Educated captives, those who could read, write, or do accounting, were incredibly expensive and were bought by rich merchants to help run their financial empires. The living style of a medieval slave entirely depended on who bought them and what they were bought for. It was a lottery where the stakes were literal life and death. If you drew the short straw, you were sent to the primary industries, the salt mines, the stone quarries, or the early sugar plantations on Mediterranean islands like Cyprus and Crete. Here, life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Slaves were viewed as disposable machinery. They were housed in cramped, disease-ridden barracks, fed just enough grain and watery stew to keep them swinging a pickaxe, and worked until their bodies broke down. If a slave died, the rich merchant simply calculated the loss and bought a replacement. Equally terrifying was the fate of the galley slaves. Naval warfare in the Mediterranean relied on massive oar-powered ships. While some rowers were paid professionals, many were slaves or convicts chained to their benches.
They ate, slept, and relieved themselves without ever leaving their seat. If the ship sank in battle, they went down with it. But there was another side to medieval slavery, one that looked a lot more comfortable, but was still a life robbed of freedom. If a slave was purchased by an aristocratic family to be a domestic servant,
Their physical living conditions were drastically better. They lived in grand castles, manors, or sprawling urban villas. They wore decent clothing, often provided by their master, so the household looked wealthy and respectable to guests.
They ate the leftovers from the Lord's table, which meant they actually had a better diet than the average free peasant working out in the mud. Their duties involved cooking, cleaning, caring for the master's children, and managing the household. But make no mistake, this was a golden cage. They had no legal rights. They could not marry without their master's permission. Any children they had were automatically born into slavery and belonged to the master, who could sell them away on a whim. Physical and sexual abuse by the masters was incredibly common and entirely legal. They were property, plain and simple. Perhaps the most mind-bending reality of medieval slavery happened in the Islamic world, with the rise of military slaves, most notably the Mamluks. In the Islamic empires, rulers often didn't trust local nobles to form their armies, fearing rebellion. So they bought thousands of young boys, mostly from the Eurasian steppes, converted them to Islam, and trained them from childhood to be the ultimate elite warriors. These Mamluks were technically slaves owned by the Sultan, but their living style was arguably better than most free men. They lived in elite military barracks, received top-tier education, were fed lavishly, and wore incredible armor. Because they were the military backbone of the empire, they held immense political power. In fact, they held so much power that in 1250, the Mamluk slaves in Egypt overthrew their masters, seized the throne, and established the Mamluk Sultanate, an empire ruled by former slaves that lasted for nearly 300 years. It is one of history's greatest ironies, slaves who became kings.
As the Middle Ages dragged on, outright chattel slavery began to decline in Western Europe. But it didn't end out of the goodness of the lords' hearts. It ended because of economics. The elite realized that buying, housing, and feeding slaves was expensive. It was actually cheaper to let peasants be free, tie them to the land as serfs, and just tax them for a percentage of the food they grew. You didn't have to feed a serf if the crops failed. That was their problem. The medieval slave trade is a stark reminder that the magnificent castles, the sprawling trade networks, and the immense wealth of the medieval elite were not just built on the backs of hardworking peasants. They were built on a massive, organized system of human suffering that crossed oceans, continents, and religions. History is rarely as clean and romantic as the movies make it out to be. If you want to learn more about the dark, unpolished truth of the Middle Ages, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. Leave a comment below. Did the Viking slave trade or the Mamluk warriors surprise you the most? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.